Good evening, and welcome to Mystery Stories, a quiet place where small villages keep careful secrets, and nothing is ever quite as simple as it appears. Tonight's tale unfolds gently, through whispered conversations, polite smiles, and moments most people overlook. There is no rush here, only the slow comfort of listening as truth reveals itself one detail at a time. Settle in, let the world soften around you, and allow the calm to carry you forward. In Mystery Stories, we believe the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that arrive softly, sit patiently beside you, and wait to be understood. Chapter 1. The first person to notice the gate was not a man who rose early, nor a woman intent on her chores, but Mrs. Elspeth Garner, who had lived opposite Arthur Bellamy's cottage for nearly 30 years and trusted the comfort of repetition more than most people trusted clocks. Each morning she drew back her curtain at precisely the same moment, more from habit than intention. And each morning she expected to see the same small, reassuring picture. Arthur's garden neat and undisturbed, the narrow gate firmly shut, the path beyond it empty until the milk cart rattled past. That morning, however, the picture had changed. The gate stood open, just wide enough to suggest purpose rather than carelessness, and Mrs. Garner paused with her curtain still gathered in her hand. She told herself at once that it meant nothing. Gates opened, after all. Wind was notorious along the lane, and Arthur Bellamy was not a man given to fuss. Still, she stood there longer than usual, feeling a faint discomfort she could not quite explain, before finally releasing the curtain and going downstairs to put the kettle on. By the time the village had fully woken, the gate had already begun its quiet work. Miss Marple became aware of it not through sight, but through tone. At the small table by the tea-room window, where she took her tea most mornings, conversation flowed as gently as ever. Yet there was a peculiar emphasis on what had not happened. No one said outright that something was wrong. Instead, they agreed, with a touch too much enthusiasm, that everything was quite ordinary. It must have been the wind, Mrs. Trent said, stirring her cup with care. These early breezes can be most unpredictable. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, her hands folded in her lap, and listened. I didn't hear a thing, added Mrs. Fletcher, who prided herself on hearing everything. Not a footstep, not a latch. I was awake, too. Well, Arthur was an early riser. Someone else offered, though without conviction. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though considering this. Arthur Bellamy was many things, but an early riser was not one of them. He kept to his routines faithfully, and rising before dawn was not among them. Still, she said nothing, content to let the conversation arrange itself. Mrs. Trent dabbed her lips with her napkin and lowered her voice, though there was no one near enough to require it. It's his gate, you know. The one at the back. He never uses it unless he's expecting someone. Miss Marple's eyes softened with interest. Expecting someone was quite different from taking a morning stroll. There were muddy marks on the path, Mrs. Garner remarked, almost apologetically, just inside the garden. I noticed them when I went past. Miss Marple's teacup paused briefly before reaching her lips. Mud, she reflected, was an honest thing. It clung where it had been, and it did not invent itself without reason. The conversation drifted on, touching lightly on weather and errands, yet returning again and again to Arthur Bellamy's cottage as though drawn by an unseen thread. Miss Marple asked a gentle question about the time, Mrs. Garner had noticed the gate. Then another about whether anyone had seen Arthur that morning. The answers were vague, full of assumptions rather than memories. Later, when the tea-room began to empty, Miss Marple rose and made her way slowly along the lane, her steps unhurried. She paused, as if merely admiring the hedge, and allowed her gaze to rest on Arthur Bellamy's garden. The gate was still open. It was a modest gate, well cared for, its wood smooth from years of use. Miss Marple approached it with the same courtesy she might show a closed door. She touched the latch lightly. It resisted her, firm and precise. There were no marks, no splinters, no sign of strain. Whoever had opened it had done so properly. Inside the garden, the path bore faint impressions, already beginning to soften in the warming air. Miss Marple noted their direction and depth, without seeming to look directly at them. The gate had not swung open by chance. It had been opened by someone who knew how. By mid-morning, the village had supplied itself with a comfortable explanation. Arthur Bellamy, it was said, must have gone out early and forgotten to close the gate. He was, after all, a quiet man, and quiet men often went unnoticed. Miss Marple heard this explanation several times, always delivered with a reassuring nod. She did not contradict it. Instead, she accepted Mrs. Trent's invitation for a second cup of tea, listening as the talk turned to Arthur's habits, his politeness, his fondness for order. Someone mentioned that his shoes were usually kept spotless, another that he disliked dirt on the rugs. Miss Marple smiled, remembering the muddy marks on the path. When news came, it arrived without drama. Arthur Bellamy had been found in his garden, lying peacefully among the late flowers, as though he had chosen to rest there. The village responded with a collective sigh of sympathy and a swift settling of conclusions. He wasn't a strong man, Mrs. Fletcher said softly. It was only a matter of time. Miss Marple stood among them, her expression kind, her posture relaxed. She observed the way certain faces turned away from the garden, the way others spoke too quickly, filling the air with certainty. She noted how the gate was mentioned less now, as though it had served its purpose and could be forgotten. As the afternoon wore on, she returned once more to the cottage, standing just long enough to notice that the latch still sat exactly as it should. No careless hand had brushed it since morning. No wind had troubled it. Miss Marple reflected that when people agreed too easily, it was often because the truth asked for more attention than they wished to give. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly to herself, knew that the open gate had been an invitation to something far less ordinary than anyone was prepared to admit. Chapter 2. No one in the village remembered exactly who said it first, but by the time the church clock had finished striking 10, the idea had already settled into place as neatly as a doily on a polished table. Arthur Bellamy had simply gone. It was sad, of course. It was also tidy. A quiet man had ended quietly in his own garden, and the village could fold the matter away with a little sympathy and a great deal of relief. Miss Marple heard the phrase before she even reached the cottage. It was merciful, really. It came from Mrs. Fletcher as she stood on the lane with her handbag held close and her mouth pursed in the particular way of someone determined to sound gentle while being perfectly certain. Two other women nodded at once. Their agreement was swift and almost grateful. Miss Marple arrived a moment later. She did not hurry. She rarely did. She moved as though the day belonged to everyone and to no one, and as though haste would only disturb the shape of things. She gave a small, kind greeting and allowed the others to keep speaking. People often revealed more when they were not interrupted. Dr. Hayward's motor car was parked at an angle near the hedge. The doctor himself stood just inside the gate, with his hat in his hand and his shoulders slightly rounded. He had the look of a man who wished he had arrived earlier. Beside him, the vicar spoke in a low voice. The vicar's tone was soothing and well-practiced. Miss Marple noticed that he kept glancing toward the kitchen window, rather than the garden path. When Dr. Hayward saw Miss Marple, he gave a brief nod that was almost a request for calm. He had known her for years. He knew the calm was not an absence of thought. It was a way of making thought more precise. "It appears to have been very sudden," he said quietly. He was not a robust man. Mrs. Garner clasped her hands together. He looked peaceful, as if he had simply sat down. Miss Marple's eyes went to the garden beyond the open gate. Arthur Bellamy lay among the late flowers with his coat drawn close. His face was turned slightly toward the house. The arrangement was almost careful. Miss Marple did not stare. She let the image rest in her mind with the same steadiness she used when listening to gossip. What mattered was not what people said it looked like. What mattered was what it truly was. "Who found him?" Miss Marple asked in a voice so mild it sounded like simple concern. Mrs. Trent stepped forward. "I did. I brought him a little bread and broth. You know how he was. He would forget to eat unless reminded. I came round the back and saw the gate open. That is what made me go in. I thought it odd. Miss Marple held Mrs. Trent's gaze kindly. You came round the back, she repeated softly. Mrs. Trent flushed faintly. Well, yes. It is quicker from my side of the lane. Miss Marple nodded as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Yet she stored the detail away. In a village, the way a person chooses to approach a house often tells you more than the reason they claim for arriving. Inside the cottage, the air held the faint warmth of a fire that had been lit earlier. The sitting room was tidy and almost severe. Arthur Bellamy had never cared for clutter. The mantelpiece held only a small clock and a single framed photograph. Miss Marple saw at once that the photograph had been dusted recently. She did not touch it. She simply noticed the clean edge where dust would have settled. The kitchen was more interesting. A tray sat on the table. On it were a teapot and one cup with a saucer. A slice of toast lay beside a small dish of marmalade. The toast had been buttered. The butter had begun to dull in the cool air. The tea in the cup was dark and still. A faint ring marked the surface where it had once been hotter. Mrs. Trent spoke again. He must have poured it and then gone out. Perhaps he heard something in the garden. Mrs. Fletcher leaned in as though the tray were a story in itself. He always drank it fresh. Always. He would never let it sit like that. Miss Marple looked down at the cup. The spoon lay across the saucer and the sugar bowl remained closed. Arthur Bellamy took 1 spoon of sugar. Always one. Miss Marple had watched him do it in the tea room more than once. The sugar bowl had not been opened. Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the back door. Did anyone check the front? She asked. Dr. Hayward answered. It was locked from the inside. As usual. As usual, Miss Marple echoed. It was a small phrase, but it carried weight. People loved the comfort of usual things. They used the word as a shield. Outside again, the lane had filled with quiet watchers. No one was loud. No one was dramatic. They spoke in softened tones as though the hedges might overhear and disapprove. Miss Marple stood near Mrs. Garner and listened as the village arranged its thoughts. He was alone, someone said. It happens. There is nothing to be done, said another. Poor man. At least he did not suffer long. Mrs. Garner glanced toward Miss Marple. It was that gate. That is what unsettles me. He never left it open. Mrs. Fletcher replied at once. A gust could do it. I did not hear any gust, Mrs. Garner said. Mrs. Fletcher gave a quick, dismissive smile. You cannot hear everything, even if you think you do. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Mrs. Fletcher's mouth as she spoke. The smile had been too quick, the words too sharp for a woman who claimed to be merely comforting. Miss Marple observed the little tension and let it pass without comment. The constable arrived late. He was young and earnest and eager to be respectful. He removed his helmet and cleared his throat. He spoke to Dr. Hayward first, and then to the vicar. There was a sense among the gathered villagers that official words would make the situation proper. Once official words existed, everyone could put their own opinions back into their pockets. Constable Pierce approached Miss Marple because everyone approached Miss Marple sooner or later. It was seldom obvious why. Sometimes it was simply because her presence made people feel watched and safe at the same time. Miss Marple, he said politely. I am sorry to trouble you. You are not troubling me at all, she replied. It is a sad day. He nodded. The doctor believes it was natural. We shall make sure everything is in order. In order, Miss Marple said gently. Yes. Order is very important. He hesitated as if he might say more. His eyes flicked toward the open gate. I was told the gate was open early, he added. Do you think that matters? Miss Marple looked at him with mild interest. What do you think? He flushed slightly. I do not know. People say it was the wind. Miss Marple gave a soft smile. People say many things because they prefer them to be true. The constable swallowed. He was not used to conversations that sounded like comfort and felt like warnings. The village moved on. Some went to the butcher. Some went to the post office. Some returned home to wash cups and wipe counters and reassure themselves that their own routines were intact. Miss Marple did not move on. She walked slowly back to the tea room where the kettle was already boiling again. Village grief was often expressed through the making of tea. It gave hands something to do. Inside the tea room, Mrs. Linton was speaking in the low, pleased tone that meant she had fresh information. "They say Arthur had been in much better spirits lately," she murmured to Mrs. Trent. "I heard it from Mrs. Pollard, who saw him only yesterday." Smiling. Smiling. Can you imagine? Arthur Bellamy. Mrs. Trent's eyes widened. He did smile. He did. He spoke of something changing soon. Miss Marple sat at a table near the window. She appeared to be looking out at the lane. In truth, she listened closely. Mrs. Trent was the sort of woman who enjoyed being useful. In villages, usefulness often meant carrying news. Mrs. Linton continued, "If he was feeling hopeful, then why would he go out so early? Unless he was expecting someone." Mrs. Trent lowered her voice. "He was expecting someone. I am sure of it. He said he had business." "Business," Mrs. Linton repeated. The word delighted her. Business implied secrets. Miss Marple waited for the tea to be poured. She watched Mrs. Linton's hands. One hand trembled slightly as she lifted the pot. Not from age. Mrs. Linton was not old enough for that. The tremor came, and then steadied. Miss Marple noted it, and also noted how Mrs. Linton immediately began to speak faster, as if talking could cover a slip. Mrs. Fletcher joined them and leaned in. "There is more," she whispered. "I saw the kitchen door of Arthur's cottage open. Just a little. Not wide. Just enough. I thought he was airing the place. But it was early, very early." Mrs. Garner looked shocked. "Why did you not mention that before?" Mrs. Fletcher smiled tightly. "Because no one asked me properly." Miss Marple's eyes stayed calm. People often hid their sharpness behind small grievances. It was a common human disguise. When Miss Marple finished her tea, she rose and walked again to Arthur Bellamy's cottage. The lane was quieter now. The watchers had gone. The gate was still open. Miss Marple paused and looked at the hinge. It moved smoothly. It did not creak. She found that notable. A gate that opened often did not complain. She stepped inside with the gentle certainty of someone who believed in manners even when no one was watching. She did not go to the garden where Arthur lay. Others would handle that. Instead, she went to the kitchen door and studied the threshold. There were faint marks on the floor. A line of dried mud. Not much. Not enough to alarm anyone who did not expect to see it. Miss Marple expected to see everything. She bent slightly and examined the shape. It was not the muddiness of a man who had come in from gardening. It was the muddiness of someone who had walked on wet lane and tried to wipe their shoes. There was a faint sweep in the mark, as though a foot had been dragged across the mat. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the mat itself. It had been shifted a fraction. A small thing. A thing most people would miss. Yet Miss Marple understood that a fraction was enough. A fraction was how lies entered a room. On the table, the tray still sat. The tea was now colder. The toast now looked stale. Miss Marple noticed that the knife on the plate had been placed carefully. Arthur Bellamy placed his knife differently. He kept it angled slightly outward. This knife lay straight, someone else's habit, perhaps. Someone who wished to appear neat. From the window, she could see the back path. The muddy impressions had softened but not vanished. They led from the gate to the door, and then away again toward the garden. If Arthur had gone out alone, he would have come back in. Yet the trail suggested a visitor who had used the kitchen door. Someone who knew the back way. Miss Marple left the cottage as quietly as she had entered, and walked a little further along the lane until she reached the post box. She did not post a letter. She simply stood there as though considering her errands. Mrs. Pollard soon came by with a basket of eggs. "Terrible about Arthur," Mrs. Pollard said at once. "Though it was bound to happen." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Bound to happen" is a comforting phrase. Mrs. Pollard gave a little laugh. "Well, he did not have family about. Only that nephew from London, and he rarely came." "A nephew," Miss Marple repeated. "I did not know he had a nephew." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Pollard said. "Not close, though. Arthur never spoke of him unless pressed. But I did hear something else. Only a whisper. You know how whispers are." Miss Marple waited. "They say Arthur visited Mr. Barlow at the solicitor's office last week," Mrs. Pollard added. "And when a man visits a solicitor, there is usually a reason." Miss Marple's expression remained gently blank. "Did anyone say what reason?" Mrs. Pollard shook her head. "Only that he looked troubled, and then later, he looked almost relieved, as if something had been settled." Miss Marple thanked her and watched her go. A man who looked relieved after seeing a solicitor had either made peace with something or decided to risk something. Risk was not a word villagers liked, yet it lived among them all the same. That evening the vicar called at Miss Marple's cottage. He did not stay long. He spoke of prayers and practicalities. He also mentioned the gate without meaning to. "It is unfortunate it was open," he said. "People will talk." Miss Marple poured tea and listened to the way his voice warmed when he spoke of preventing gossip. He wanted the village calm. Clergymen often did. Calm made faith easier to offer. "The gate seems to matter to you," Miss Marple said softly. He looked surprised. "Only because it gives people ideas." "Sometimes ideas are the beginning of truth," Miss Marple replied. He smiled politely as though she had said something quaint. Miss Marple smiled back as though she had said nothing at all. After he left, she sat for a long time by her window. The lane outside was quiet. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Somewhere a radio played softly. Everything looked as safe as a picture in a frame. Yet Miss Marple could not forget the untouched sugar bowl, the straight-placed knife, the gate that did not creak, the way Mrs. Linton's hand had trembled, the way Mrs. Fletcher had taken offense at not being asked properly. She thought of Arthur Bellamy smiling yesterday. She thought of him pouring tea and not drinking it. She thought of him expecting someone and choosing the garden gate rather than the front door. And as the evening settled gently around the village, Miss Marple's calm smile returned in the quiet darkness of her sitting room, because she understood something the others did not yet dare to hold. Arthur Bellamy had not gone into his garden by chance at all, and whoever came through that gate had been close enough to him to be welcomed. Chapter 3. No one spoke of money aloud at first. In the village, it was considered poor manners to discuss such things directly, particularly in the days following a passing. Instead, it crept into conversation sideways, disguised as concern or practicality, slipping into remarks about bills, errands, and unfinished arrangements. Miss Marple noticed this at once. She had long observed that when people avoided a subject with great care, it was usually because it sat very close to the truth. She first heard it mentioned at the post office. Mrs. Hawthorne stood at the counter with a small stack of envelopes. Her voice lowered, but not quite enough to be private. "I only wondered," she said to the postmistress, "whether Arthur had settled everything before he went. He was very particular about accounts." The postmistress nodded. "Oh, yes. He always paid promptly. Still, there was talk that he had been generous lately." Miss Marple paused to examine a display of stamps she did not intend to buy and listened. "Generous," Mrs. Hawthorne repeated thoughtfully. "That is not quite like Arthur, is it?" "No," the postmistress agreed. "Not unless he had a reason." Miss Marple turned at last, offering a mild smile that invited confidence. "Arthur was always kind," she said gently, "but kindness takes many forms." Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated and then leaned a fraction closer. "He lent money," she said. "That much I know. I cannot say to whom. He did not tell me. But I saw him counting notes only last week. I remarked upon it, because it seemed unlike him." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, the image of Arthur Bellamy counting money fitting neatly with what she had already observed. Lending money was not merely a financial act. It was a relationship, and relationships were rarely as simple as they appeared. That afternoon, condolences continued, each visit bringing with it another fragment of Arthur's private life. Miss Marple made her way once more to the cottage, not as an intruder, but as a familiar presence. She had known Arthur Bellamy long enough that no one thought it strange she should wish to look about, though few realized what she was truly looking for. Mrs. Trent arrived shortly after, carrying a basket she claimed was filled with cleaning cloths. She set it down and sighed heavily. "I cannot bear to think of the place standing idle," she said. "He would not like that. Everything so orderly." "Everything in its place," Miss Marple nodded. "Order can be very comforting." Mrs. Trent glanced toward the garden and lowered her voice. "People are saying things about money, about his will." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained kindly. "What sort of things?" Mrs. Trent pressed her lips together. "They say he changed it recently. Not the whole thing. Just a clause or two." "That is what Mr. Barlow let slip at the grocer's." "Mr. Barlow," Miss Marple repeated. "The solicitor—" "Yes, he did not mean to say it. But he did. And once something is said, it cannot be taken back." Miss Marple reflected that this was particularly true in villages. Words once released tended to wander freely. They moved through the cottage together. Mrs. Trent spoke of Arthur's habits, his dislike of fuss, his preference for quiet evenings. Miss Marple listened, occasionally asking a question that seemed casual but was in fact very precise. When they reached the small study at the back of the house, Miss Marple paused. The desk was neat, but not untouched. Papers lay stacked in careful piles. One drawer stood slightly ajar. "Arthur did not like drawers left open," Mrs. Trent said quickly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "He did not." She opened it fully. Inside lay a bundle of envelopes tied with string. Miss Marple did not untie them. She did not need to. The addresses were visible enough. Several bore familiar names. Mrs. Trent inhaled sharply. "Those are villagers' names." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "People he knew and trusted," Mrs. Trent added before she could stop herself. Miss Marple closed the drawer. Trust, she thought, was often expensive. Outside, voices drifted in from the lane. Mrs. Fletcher stood with Mrs. Linton, their heads inclined together. Miss Marple could hear just enough to know the tone. "He should never have lent it," Mrs. Fletcher was saying. "Not to her. Everyone knows she has trouble managing." Mrs. Linton responded with a soft murmur that carried agreement rather than surprise. Miss Marple stepped into view, and both women straightened at once, their expressions smoothing into polite concern. "We were only saying how generous Arthur was," Mrs. Linton said quickly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Generosity is rarely forgotten." Mrs. Fletcher cleared her throat. "It can cause resentment, though. People feel awkward owing money." "They do," Miss Marple said, "and awkwardness often leads to mistakes." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes flickered away. Miss Marple noticed and filed it away. Later, at the grocer's, the subject resurfaced again. Mr. Dobbins leaned across the counter as though sharing a confidence with the weighing scales. "I supplied Arthur with goods on credit once or twice," he said. "Not because he needed it. Because he asked. He said it was temporary." "And did he settle it?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, yes," Mr. Dobbins replied. "Promptly. He was quite particular about clearing what he owed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Arthur Bellamy did not like loose ends. If he had lent money, it was unlikely he did so carelessly. As the day wore on, patterns began to emerge. Arthur had been seen speaking earnestly with more than one person in recent weeks. He had visited the solicitor. He had appeared lighter of spirit afterward. Miss Marple considered this as she walked slowly along the lane, her thoughts moving with the same unhurried pace. She stopped near Arthur's garden and watched Mrs. Linton pass by on the opposite side. Mrs. Linton did not look toward the gate. She kept her eyes fixed ahead and quickened her step. Miss Marple noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands tightened around her handbag. Not everyone avoided the garden. Mr. Collins, the neighbor, lingered near the hedge, pretending to examine a rose bush that was not his. He glanced at Miss Marple and then at the open gate. "Still open," he said unnecessarily. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It seems reluctant to close." Mr. Collins laughed lightly. "Funny how such a small thing can trouble people." "Small things often do," Miss Marple said. He hesitated. "Arthur and I spoke recently. About money." Miss Marple looked at him. "Did you—" "Yes. Well." He spoke. I listened. He was worried someone would not repay him. He did not say who. "And did you advise him?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Collins shifted his weight. "I told him to be patient. Things have a way of working out." Miss Marple considered that. Patience was good advice when time was on one side. That evening, as dusk softened the edges of the village, Miss Marple received another visitor. Mrs. Garner arrived with a small plate of biscuits and an expression that suggested she had decided something. "I should not say this," she began, "but I will." Miss Marple poured tea and waited. "Arthur gave money to someone who did not deserve it," Mrs. Garner said. "Someone who had already taken advantage of him. I saw them arguing once." In low voices. "Near the back gate." "Near the back gate," Miss Marple repeated. "Yes." I could not hear the words, but I saw Arthur shake his head. I saw the other person lean in close. Too close. Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "Did you recognize them?" Mrs. Garner hesitated. "I thought I did, but I might be mistaken." "People often are," Miss Marple said kindly, "and often are not." Mrs. Garner looked relieved by this and continued. "What unsettled me was that Arthur looked frightened, not angry. Frightened." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Fear changed people. It also made them predictable. After Mrs. Garner left, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long while. She thought of Arthur's neat arrangements, his careful habits, the way his breakfast had been prepared and left untouched. She thought of money passing hands, of trust stretched thin, of fear whispered near an open gate. The village had decided that Arthur Bellamy's end was natural. It had decided this because it was easier than examining the web of obligations and resentments that now lay exposed. Miss Marple understood that money had not merely changed hands. It had changed expectations. As night settled, she walked once more past Arthur's cottage. The gate stood open still, though no one passed through it now. Miss Marple regarded it with calm certainty. Money, she reflected, rarely caused trouble by itself. It was what people believed it entitled them to do that made it dangerous. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly in the gathering dark, knew that whoever owed Arthur Bellamy most was unlikely to have wished him long life. Chapter 4. The story about the voices began as these things usually did in the village. Not as an announcement, but as an afterthought. It surfaced between remarks about bread prices and the difficulty of getting proper deliveries now, offered almost casually, as though it were too small to matter and therefore safe to share. Miss Marple heard it while standing near the church porch, where the stones still held the day's warmth and people tended to linger longer than they intended. "I heard them myself," Mr. Collins said. His voice pitched carefully low. Late at night. Two voices. Not raised. Just talking. Mrs. Linton looked at him with interest sharpened by restraint. "Talking in the garden." "Yes. Near the gate." Miss Marple stood a little apart. appearing to study the notice board where the same announcements had been pinned for weeks. She did not turn. She did not need to. Mr. Collins's voice had changed. It was only slight, but she had heard that note before in others. It was the sound of someone enjoying attention while pretending not to. "What time was it?" Mrs. Linton asked. Mr. Collins hesitated. "Hard to say exactly. Late enough that one notices." Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. People who were certain remembered times. People who were not preferred vagueness. She joined them then, her expression open and mildly curious. "You heard voices," she said gently. "That must have unsettled you." Mr. Collins waved a hand. "Oh no, not really. People talk. Arthur might have had a visitor." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Visitors are not unusual." Mrs. Linton leaned forward. "Did you recognize them?" Mr. Collins shook his head too quickly. "No. I was indoors, windows closed." Miss Marple noted the emphasis on windows. She also noted that Mr. Collins's cottage stood close enough to Arthur Bellamy's garden that even closed windows would not have softened familiar voices beyond recognition. "That was considerate of you," Miss Marple said kindly. "Not to listen." Mr. Collins flushed faintly. "One does not eavesdrop." "No," Miss Marple said. "One merely hears." He laughed a little and changed the subject with visible relief. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane that curved past the backs of the cottages. It was a pleasant route, often overlooked, and people were less careful there. She encountered Mrs. Garner near the hedge, and they walked together for a short distance. "Mr. Collins enjoys being helpful," Mrs. Garner remarked, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Helpfulness takes many forms." Mrs. Garner glanced toward Arthur's garden. "He said he heard voices. I live closer than he does. And I heard nothing." Miss Marple considered this. "Do you often hear voices from the garden?" Mrs. Garner shook her head. "Only when people mean to be heard." They parted at the bend in the lane, and Miss Marple continued alone. She slowed near Mr. Collins's cottage and paused as though admiring the roses. The back windows were open. The position offered a clear line of sound toward Arthur's garden. That evening, as dusk crept in and lamps were lit behind curtains, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with the window slightly open. She had learned long ago that the village spoke most freely when it believed itself alone. Voices drifted from the lane, softened but distinct. It was Mr. Collins again, speaking to someone Miss Marple could not see. "I told them what I heard," he said. "It is only right." A woman's voice responded, low and tense. "You did not hear anything." "I heard enough," Mr. Collins said. "Enough to be useful." Miss Marple's eyes remained on her teacup, but her attention sharpened. The word useful carried weight. "You should be careful," the woman replied. "People will ask questions." Mr. Collins laughed lightly. "Questions can be managed." The voices moved on, and the lane fell quiet. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and considered what she had heard. People who truly overheard something of consequence tended to be uncertain, troubled, reluctant. Mr. Collins was none of these. He was pleased. The next morning, the constable returned to the village, his notebook in hand and his expression earnest. He spoke with several residents and listened carefully, nodding at appropriate moments. When he reached Miss Marple, he removed his helmet again. "I understand someone heard voices the night before," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Mr. Collins mentioned it." "Did he say anything more to you?" "Only that he wished to be helpful," Miss Marple said, "and that he did not recognize the voices." The constable frowned slightly. He was quite certain about the number. 2 voices. He insisted upon it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Certainty can be comforting. The constable hesitated. "Do you think it matters?" Miss Marple considered before answering. "I think it matters who wishes it to matter." The constable looked thoughtful and thanked her. Word spread quickly that Mr. Collins had spoken to the constable. The village absorbed this information with a mixture of approval and suspicion. Some praised his sense of duty. Others wondered quietly why he had waited. Miss Marple heard the speculation while waiting at the butcher's. He always did like to be noticed. Mrs. Fletcher murmured. Remember how he spoke at the parish meeting? Went on and on. Yes, Mrs. Trent replied. But this is different. This is important. Mrs. Fletcher lowered her voice further. Important things are often handled quietly, not paraded. Miss Marple caught Mrs. Fletcher's eye and smiled. Mrs. Fletcher looked away at once. At midday, Miss Marple walked again to Arthur Bellamy's cottage. The gate had finally been closed, though not latched properly. She opened it and shut it again, listening carefully. The hinge made no sound. Inside the garden, the flowers stood undisturbed. Miss Marple traced the path with her eyes. She imagined the scene Mr. Collins had described. Two people speaking softly. Late at night, near the gate. If voices had been raised, Mrs. Garner would have heard. If they had been familiar, Mr. Collins would have recognized them. Unless, of course, he chose not to say so. Miss Marple returned to the lane and encountered Mr. Collins himself, as though summoned by thought. Good afternoon, he said cheerfully. I hear the constable has been asking questions. Yes, Miss Marple replied. That often happens. He nodded. I told him exactly what I told everyone else. Nothing more, nothing less. That is admirable, Miss Marple said. Consistency is reassuring. He smiled, pleased. One must do one's duty. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though duty can be interpreted in many ways. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. I only wish to help. Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. Do you often listen late at night? He laughed. I am a light sleeper. And do you often hear voices from the garden? He hesitated. Not usually, but you did that night. Yes. And yet you heard nothing else, Miss Marple continued gently. No footsteps, no gate, no door. Mr. Collins shifted his weight. Perhaps I was half asleep. Perhaps, Miss Marple said. She watched him walk away, his back stiffening as he went. That evening, Mrs. Linton came to Miss Marple's cottage, her manner nervous and her hands restless. I should not have listened, she said at once, but I did. Miss Marple poured tea. Listening is rarely a fault. I heard Mr. Collins speaking with someone last night. Mrs. Linton whispered. He was boasting, saying that he had done the right thing, that he had made himself useful. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the other person? They told him to be careful. Did you recognize the voice? Mrs. Linton hesitated. I thought I did, but I could be mistaken. Miss Marple smiled gently. Mistakes are understandable. Mrs. Linton leaned closer. It sounded like someone who knew Arthur well. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained calm. Someone who would speak quietly near his gate. Yes, and who would not wish their voice recognized. Mrs. Linton nodded. After she left, Miss Marple sat quietly and considered the shape of things. Mr. Collins's story had arrived fully formed, polished, and convenient. It placed him at the center without placing him at risk. It suggested activity without providing detail. It implied importance without responsibility. She thought of Arthur Bellamy's careful habits. She thought of the gate that did not creak. She thought of the tea poured and left untouched. Voices, she reflected, were easy to invent and difficult to disprove. Yet they left impressions all the same, in the way people repeated them, in the way they were used. The next morning, the village spoke of Mr. Collins with admiration. He had done his part. He had helped the authorities. The matter was being handled. Miss Marple walked past Arthur's garden once more. The gate stood closed now, as though ashamed of the attention it had drawn. She rested her hand lightly on it and felt the smoothness of the latch. Someone had spoken near this gate. Of that she was certain. But not in the way Mr. Collins described, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly as she continued down the lane, knew that the loudest voice in the matter belonged to the man who had heard the least. Chapter 5. The letter was mentioned first as an inconvenience. "It is most awkward," Mrs. Trent said, pressing her lips together as she stood beside the small table in Arthur Bellamy's sitting room. "One never knows what to do with such things. Personal correspondence should remain private. Yet it feels wrong to ignore it entirely." Miss Marple looked at the envelope resting between them. It was cream-colored and unremarkable, the sort sold in any stationer's shop. What made it interesting was not how it looked, but how often it had been handled. The paper was softened at the edges, the corners dulled slightly, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times before finally being set aside. "Who found it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I did," Mrs. Trent replied. "It was on the desk, beneath a ledger. I only noticed it because the fold was uneven. Arthur was very precise about such things." Miss Marple nodded. "Precision left traces when it was disturbed." She lifted the envelope carefully, reading the name written on the front. It was Arthur Bellamy's own handwriting, neat and measured. The address was local. The sort of address one did not need to think about. Someone nearby. Someone familiar. "He never sent it," Mrs. Trent added. "There is no stamp." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It appears he kept it close instead." They opened it together, though Miss Marple already suspected what she would find. The letter itself was brief, polite, almost disappointingly ordinary. It spoke of a meeting postponed, of matters to be settled quietly, of the importance of discretion. There was no warmth in the phrasing, but there was urgency. Miss Marple read it twice, not for the words themselves, but for what lay beneath them. "It does not sound like affection," Mrs. Trent said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It sounds like necessity." Mrs. Trent shifted uneasily. "The date is odd. It says Monday. But Arthur told me he had already met with someone that evening." Miss Marple's eyes returned to the letter. Then perhaps the meeting did not go as planned. They folded the letter again. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Trent aligned the edges too carefully, as though trying to restore order by force of habit. Word of the letter spread faster than Mrs. Trent had intended. By afternoon, it had already become something more than it was. In the village, a letter was never just a letter. It was a confession, waiting to be misread. Miss Marple encountered the first version of it at the grocer's. "They say Arthur was being threatened," Mrs. Fletcher murmured, leaning closer to the counter. "A letter proves it." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Fletcher blinked. "Well, that is what people are saying." "And what do you think?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Fletcher hesitated. "I think he was worried. He had reason to be." Miss Marple paid for her bread and stepped aside, allowing another customer to approach. Mrs. Fletcher watched her go with an expression that suggested disappointment. She had hoped for agreement. Agreement was more satisfying than truth. Outside, the lane hummed softly with afternoon life. Miss Marple walked slowly, letting the pieces arrange themselves in her mind. The letter had been written, folded, unfolded, and never sent. That meant Arthur Bellamy had wanted its message known, but not delivered. A curious contradiction. She stopped near the low wall by the green and sat for a moment, watching children pass with solemn expressions as though the seriousness of the village had infected even them. Mrs. Linton joined her a short while later, her movements restless. "I heard about the letter," she said at once. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It is difficult to keep anything quiet." Mrs. Linton clasped her handbag. "Arthur showed me something like that once. Not the same letter, but a note. Folded the same way." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Did he?" "Yes." "He seemed unsure what to do with it. He asked whether I thought it best to confront the matter directly." "And what did you advise?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Linton swallowed. I told him discretion was best, that villages have long memories. Indeed they do, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Linton's shoulders relaxed slightly. He looked relieved when I said it. Relieved again, Miss Marple thought. Arthur Bellamy had felt relief more than once recently. Relief implied resolution. Or the hope of it. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a call on Mr. Barlow, the solicitor. She did not announce her purpose. She rarely did. She merely asked after his health and admired the orderliness of his office. I understand Arthur Bellamy visited you recently, she said at last. Mr. Barlow cleared his throat. Yes. A routine matter. Routine, Miss Marple echoed. He wished to make a small adjustment to his affairs, Mr. Barlow continued. Nothing unusual. Miss Marple smiled. Adjustments often come from unusual circumstances. Mr. Barlow hesitated. I am bound by discretion. Of course, Miss Marple said kindly. I would not expect otherwise. She rose to leave and paused as though recalling something. Did Arthur appear troubled? Mr. Barlow considered before answering. Concerned, but determined. Determined people often take risks, Miss Marple observed. Mr. Barlow did not respond. As she walked back toward the lane, Miss Marple reflected that Arthur Bellamy had been preparing for something. Letters unsent. Wills adjusted. Money lent. He had been trying to tidy his life before something forced his hand. That evening, another letter came to light. Mrs. Garner appeared at Miss Marple's door just after dusk, her expression apologetic. I did not think it mattered at first, she said, but now I am not so sure. Miss Marple invited her in and poured tea. I received a letter from Arthur last week, Mrs. Garner continued. Very brief. He asked whether I would be at home on Tuesday evening. I said yes, but he never came. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. May I see it? Mrs. Garner produced the letter from her pocket. It was folded in exactly the same way. Miss Marple examined it carefully. The phrasing was similar. Polite. Urgent. Non-committal. He wrote to several people, Miss Marple said softly. Yes, Mrs. Garner replied. I thought it strange. Arthur was not a man for spreading his troubles. Unless he was seeking advice, Miss Marple said. Or support. Mrs. Garner frowned. Or witnesses. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps. As Mrs. Garner left, Miss Marple sat quietly with the two letters before her. They were not identical, but they were close enough to suggest a pattern. Arthur Bellamy had reached out to more than one person. He had been careful not to commit himself fully to any one of them. She thought of Mr. Collins's enthusiasm, Mrs. Linton's trembling hands, Mrs. Fletcher's sharp remarks. She thought of voices near the gate and of letters folded too often. The next morning brought another small revelation. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Trent near the tea room, her expression troubled. There is something else, Mrs. Trent said. I did not mention it because I thought it unimportant. Miss Marple waited. I found a letter like the others. Mrs. Trent continued. In Arthur's pocket, addressed to someone in the village. It had been carried about for days, which suggests he intended to give it in person, Miss Marple said. Yes, but he never did. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then the meeting may have occurred instead. Mrs. Trent looked pale. You think the letter relates to what happened? I think letters tell us what people are afraid to say aloud, Miss Marple replied. By midday, the village buzzed with speculation. Some believed Arthur had been entangled in something improper. Others suggested he had discovered a secret and been frightened into silence. Each theory grew more elaborate with each telling. Miss Marple listened and said little. She watched instead how certain people reacted when the letters were mentioned. Mrs. Fletcher grew defensive. Mrs. Linton grew quieter. Mr. Collins grew animated. I heard he was writing to everyone, Mr. Collins said loudly near the post office. Poor man must have been terribly anxious. Yes, Miss Marple said mildly. Anxiety often leads to correspondence. Mr. Collins laughed. I suppose he wanted advice or resolution, Miss Marple added. Mr. Collins's laughter faded. Resolution. Yes, Miss Marple said. To end a difficulty. That evening, Miss Marple returned once more to Arthur Bellamy's cottage. The constable had left for the day. The place felt oddly hollow, as though it knew it was being examined. She stood in the study and imagined Arthur sitting there, writing his careful letters, folding them, unfolding them, debating what to do next. She imagined him choosing not to send them, deciding instead to speak face to face. Face-to-face conversations required trust. She walked into the garden and closed the gate behind her. It made no sound. She pictured Arthur opening it that night, expecting someone who knew his habits, someone who understood the importance of discretion, someone who might have received a letter and chosen to answer it personally. Miss Marple returned home as the lamps were being lit. She sat by her window and looked out at the lane, calm and untroubled on the surface. Letters were powerful things, she reflected. They recorded intention. They revealed hesitation. They left behind a map of a person's thoughts. Arthur Bellamy had left such a map behind him, though he had not intended to. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly as she folded her hands in her lap, knew that whoever had answered his letter in person had done so with a purpose far darker than advice. Chapter 6. The tremor was so slight that no one remarked upon it at first. In a village where teacups were lifted and set down a dozen times an hour, a shaking hand was easily forgiven as age, nerves, or a chill that lingered longer than expected. Miss Marple noticed it because she always noticed such things, and because it appeared and vanished too quickly to be accidental. It happened at Mrs. Linton's table. The gathering had formed without planning, as these gatherings always did, drawn together by the polite fiction of condolence and the unspoken desire to be included. Cups were passed, plates offered, chairs arranged just so. Mrs. Linton presided with careful attentiveness, her voice pleasant and her smile fixed. Miss Marple sat opposite her, listening. Mrs. Linton lifted the teapot. For an instant her hand wavered, just enough for the tea to slosh faintly against the porcelain. Then she steadied it at once and laughed. "How silly of me," she said. "I suppose I am more tired than I thought." Miss Marple accepted her cup with thanks and watched as Mrs. Linton placed the pot down with unnecessary firmness. The moment passed. Conversation resumed. No one else appeared to have noticed, but Miss Marple had. Talk drifted as it always did toward Arthur Bellamy. There was sympathy in the voices, and relief as well. A passing that required no further action was a gift to a village. "He was always so particular," Mrs. Fletcher remarked. Everything had its place. Yes, Mrs. Linton agreed quickly. He disliked disorder. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Some people dislike disorder because it unsettles them," she said. "Others because it reminds them of something they would rather not recall." Mrs. Linton's smile tightened. Arthur was simply that sort of man. Mrs. Garner cleared her throat. "He was not unkind." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "He was not." As the conversation continued, Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Linton spoke whenever the gate was mentioned. Her tone became brighter, her sentences longer. She supplied details that had not been asked for, reassuring everyone that Arthur's habits were well known and unremarkable. "He always locked the front door," she said. "Always. Even during the day." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He was careful. And he disliked surprises," Mrs. Linton continued. "He preferred appointments." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Linton nodded. "He was very clear about such things." Miss Marple took a sip of tea. Arthur Bellamy had indeed liked appointments, which made his choice of a garden gate meeting all the more interesting. A little later, Mrs. Fletcher leaned toward Miss Marple with the air of someone imparting a confidence. "Mrs. Linton was quite distressed yesterday," she whispered, after the constable came by. "I thought she might faint." Miss Marple regarded Mrs. Fletcher calmly. "Many people dislike official visits." Mrs. Fletcher smiled thinly. "Some more than others." Miss Marple filed that away. When the gathering broke up, Miss Marple lingered a moment, thanking Mrs. Linton for her hospitality. Mrs. Linton insisted on walking her to the door. "You must not think us heartless," she said earnestly. "We all cared for Arthur." "I am sure you did," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Linton hesitated, then added, "People are saying such strange things. About money, about letters. It is all quite unnecessary." "Strangeness often follows loss," Miss Marple said kindly. "People search for explanations." Mrs. Linton nodded too quickly. "Exactly." Outside, Miss Marple paused at the gate. "You knew Arthur well," she said lightly. "Did he ever mention the garden gate to you?" Mrs. Linton's hand tightened on her handbag. "The gate? Oh, no. Why would he?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Why would he?" She walked on, leaving Mrs. Linton standing very still. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a longer walk than usual, looping around the far side of the village where fewer people ventured. She encountered Mr. Collins near the path that ran behind Arthur's garden. "Good afternoon," he said cheerfully. "Out enjoying the weather?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It is a fine day for noticing things." He laughed. "Always observant." "I try to be," Miss Marple said. They walked together for a short distance. Mr. Collins spoke readily, filling the space with commentary about the village's resilience and the importance of community. "It is fortunate," he said, "that Arthur's passing was straightforward." "Was it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. He stopped. "Well, natural causes. Everyone agrees, everyone," Miss Marple echoed. He cleared his throat. "You do not think so. I think agreement is not the same as certainty," she said. Mr. Collins laughed again, though it sounded forced. "You always did enjoy puzzles." Miss Marple smiled. "People are far more puzzling than events." They parted soon after. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the tension in his shoulders and the speed of his steps. People who felt at ease did not hurry away from conversation. The next clue arrived wrapped in domestic routine. Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Trent later that day, finding her in the midst of sorting linens. "I have been thinking," Mrs. Trent said as soon as Miss Marple entered. "About Arthur's kitchen." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "So have I." "The cup," Mrs. Trent continued, "the way it was left." "He never did that." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "He drank his tea promptly. And he always took sugar," Mrs. Trent added. "1 spoon." "Without fail," Miss Marple nodded. "The sugar bowl was closed." Mrs. Trent frowned. "Perhaps he was distracted." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps someone else poured the tea." Mrs. Trent's eyes widened. "But why would someone do that?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Because offering tea is a way of being polite. Even when one is in a hurry." Mrs. Trent sank into a chair. "You think someone was with him in the kitchen?" "I think someone knew how he liked things done," Miss Marple said. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage. It was intended as comfort for the community. It became, inevitably, an exchange of impressions. Mrs. Fletcher spoke animatedly. "I saw Mrs. Linton yesterday evening. She seemed unsettled." "Yes," Mrs. Garner agreed. "She dropped her keys." Miss Marple listened. "She has had a great deal to manage," the vicar offered kindly. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Linton across the room. She sat stiffly, her smile polite, her eyes darting whenever Arthur's name was mentioned. Miss Marple moved closer. "I hear you have been very busy," she said warmly. Mrs. Linton nodded. "There is so much to do. One wants to be helpful." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Helpfulness is admirable." Mrs. Linton swallowed. "I only wish people would stop speculating." "Speculation fills silence," Miss Marple replied. "Silence is uncomfortable." Mrs. Linton glanced toward the door. "Arthur never liked silence." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "He preferred clarity." The words seemed to land heavily between them. Later, as the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple overheard a brief exchange near the door. "You should be careful," Mrs. Fletcher murmured to Mrs. Linton. "People are watching." Mrs. Linton replied sharply, "I have nothing to hide." Miss Marple noted the emphasis on nothing. The next morning brought rain, light but persistent. Miss Marple walked again to Arthur Bellamy's garden. The path glistened. The gate stood closed. She opened it gently. It swung inward without sound. Inside, she imagined the final moments. Arthur waiting. Someone approaching whom he trusted enough to admit quietly. Tea poured. Conversation spoken low. Something said that caused tension. A hand trembling. A cup left untouched. Miss Marple closed the gate and stood for a moment, listening to the rain. A trembling hand, she reflected, betrayed more than fear. It betrayed effort. Someone had been struggling to maintain control. As she turned back toward the lane, Miss Marple smiled kindly, though there was little kindness in her thoughts now, because she understood that the person who shook while pouring tea was not grieving. They were remembering. Chapter 7. The wind failed to behave. Miss Marple noticed this first, standing quietly at the edge of the green just after breakfast, her coat drawn close more from habit than need. The breeze moved the leaves gently, stirred a loose scrap of paper along the path, and then settled again. It was the sort of mild, cooperative wind that villagers like to blame when something inconvenient needed explaining. It lifted nothing with force. It opened nothing that did not wish to be opened. And yet the gate had opened. The thought rested with her as she made her way, unhurried, toward Arthur Bellamy's cottage. The village had grown calmer in the days since his passing. Calm, Miss Marple knew, often arrived not because questions were answered, but because people had grown tired of asking them. Near the hedge, she found the constable waiting. He greeted her politely, notebook tucked beneath his arm. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning," she replied. "You are early." "Yes," he said. "I wanted another look. For my own peace of mind." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Peace of mind is worth pursuing." They walked together toward the garden. The constable gestured toward the gate. "People keep mentioning the wind. I thought I would see for myself." "A sensible idea," Miss Marple said. He placed his hand on the gate and gave it a light push. It did not move. He tried again, a little harder. Still nothing. Only when he lifted the latch deliberately did it open, swinging inward with quiet obedience. The constable frowned. "That is not what I expected." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Wind is rarely so precise." He closed it and stepped back. "It would require intention." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and familiarity." They stood for a moment in silence. The constable cleared his throat. "I suppose someone could have forgotten to latch it." "Someone could," Miss Marple replied, "though Arthur Bellamy did not." The constable nodded slowly. He had heard that refrain before. He was beginning to believe it. Inside the garden, the constable examined the ground where impressions had once been visible. Rain had softened them now. But Miss Marple could still trace the pattern with her eyes. She had learned long ago that the mind remembered what the ground forgot. "I have been thinking about the voices," the constable said. "Mr. Collins remains very sure of himself." "Confidence is not proof," Miss Marple said gently. "It is often compensation." The constable hesitated. "Do you think he is lying?" "I think he is arranging," Miss Marple replied. "There is a difference." They parted soon after. Miss Marple continued her walk, turning down the lane that passed Mrs. Linton's house. Curtains were drawn back, windows open. Domestic order was on display. Mrs. Linton herself stood at the door, keys in hand. She looked surprised to see Miss Marple, and then relieved, as though relief were her default response to interruption. "Out for a walk," she said quickly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I find it clears the mind." Mrs. Linton nodded. "One needs that lately." They walked together for a short distance. Mrs. Linton spoke of small things. The difficulty of keeping milk fresh. The annoyance of damp weather. Miss Marple listened and watched the way her companion's fingers tightened around the keys whenever Arthur's cottage came into view. "I hear the constable has been about again," Mrs. Linton said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. He wished to test a theory. Mrs. Linton laughed lightly. People do enjoy theories. They do, Miss Marple said. Especially when they explain away effort. Mrs. Linton's laugh faltered. Effort. Yes, Miss Marple continued pleasantly. Opening gates. Pouring tea. Remembering habits. Mrs. Linton stopped walking. Miss Marple stopped with her. I do not know what you mean, Mrs. Linton said. I rarely mean anything specific, Miss Marple replied. I only observe. They stood there, the lane quiet around them. A cart rattled distantly. Somewhere a door closed. Mrs. Linton recovered herself and smiled. You are very perceptive, so people say, Miss Marple answered. They parted soon after, Mrs. Linton turning back toward her house with a stiffness that did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple continued on to the tea room where conversation was already in progress. Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Trent sat close together, voices lowered. I cannot understand why he would not simply say who he was meeting, Mrs. Trent murmured. Because he was afraid, Mrs. Fletcher replied. That is what I think. Miss Marple took a seat nearby. Afraid of what? Mrs. Trent asked. Mrs. Fletcher shrugged. Of causing trouble. Or perhaps of being wrong. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Fear often leads people to choose the quietest path. Mrs. Fletcher looked at her sharply. You think he chose the gate to be discreet? Yes, Miss Marple said. And because discretion requires trust. Mrs. Trent frowned. You trust someone or you do not? Not quite, Miss Marple replied. Sometimes you trust someone with one thing and fear them with another. The tea room fell quiet for a moment. Later, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Collins. She did not announce her purpose. She simply remarked upon his roses and accepted his invitation to step inside. His sitting room was neat, though the neatness felt practiced rather than natural. You have been very helpful, Miss Marple said pleasantly as he poured tea. I only did what was right, he replied. I told the constable exactly what I heard. Voices, Miss Marple said. 2 of them. Yes, Mr. Collins said firmly. At what hour? Miss Marple asked. Late, he replied. After dark. And how long did they speak? She continued. Not long, he said. A few minutes. Long enough to recognize their voices, Miss Marple suggested. He hesitated. I did not recognize them. Miss Marple nodded. Strange. One often recognizes voices in the dark more easily than faces. Mr. Collins laughed, though there was no humor in it. I was not listening closely. Of course not, Miss Marple said. Listening closely would imply interest. He shifted in his chair. You think I wanted attention. I think you wanted relevance, Miss Marple replied gently. Mr. Collins bristled. I resent that. I am sorry, Miss Marple said. I did not mean to upset you. She rose to leave and paused near the door. One more thing. When you heard the voices, did you hear the gate? Mr. Collins opened his mouth, then closed it. I cannot recall, he said at last. That is unfortunate, Miss Marple replied. It makes all the difference. Outside, she walked slowly away, allowing her thoughts to settle. That afternoon, Mrs. Garner came to see her again. Her expression, uneasy. I have been thinking about that night, she said. About who might have gone through the gate. Yes, Miss Marple replied. There is only one person I can imagine Arthur trusting enough to meet quietly, Mrs. Garner continued. And only one person who would insist on using the back. Miss Marple waited. Someone who did not wish to be seen, Mrs. Garner said. Someone who feared gossip. Gossip, Miss Marple said softly. And consequences. Mrs. Garner nodded. I saw that person earlier that evening. They were anxious, kept glancing at the time. Did Arthur appear anxious? Miss Marple asked. No, Mrs. Garner replied. He looked resolved. Resolved. The word echoed in Miss Marple's mind. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned once more to Arthur Bellamy's garden. She did so alone this time. She closed the gate carefully and tested it again. It resisted until she lifted the latch. The sound it made was barely audible. A soft, metallic whisper. She imagined the scene with increasing clarity. Arthur opening the gate himself. A familiar figure stepping inside. Low voices. Tea poured out of habit. Something said that changed the air in the room. A moment of hesitation. A hand trembling. She thought of the letters, the money, the fear of exposure. She thought of Mrs. Linton's insistence on order, and her refusal to meet Miss Marple's eyes when the gate was mentioned. She thought of Mr. Collins's eagerness to be useful without being precise. Miss Marple returned home as dusk settled fully over the village. Lamps flickered on. Curtains were drawn. The village prepared itself for sleep, content that the day had passed without disruption. Miss Marple sat by her window and looked out at the lane. Everything appeared calm. Safe. Ordinary. Yet she knew now that the wind had nothing to do with the gate. She knew that Arthur Bellamy had not been surprised by his visitor. She knew that the person who entered his garden had done so with intention, and had left with more than they brought. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly as the night deepened, knew that the truth was no longer waiting to be found. It was waiting to be spoken aloud. Chapter 8. They gathered in the sitting room not because anyone had suggested it, but because the village had reached that quiet moment when avoidance required more effort than attention. Chairs were drawn up with careful politeness. Teacups were set down and left untouched. Curtains were half drawn, not to shut out the evening, but to contain it. Miss Marple arrived last. She entered with the unremarkable ease that had always allowed her to pass unnoticed when she wished, and unavoidable when she did not. She greeted everyone kindly and took the chair nearest the window, where the fading light softened the room and revealed small things people preferred to keep hidden. No one spoke at first. It was Mrs. Trent who broke the silence, her voice thin with expectation. "The constable said you wished us all to be here." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "It seemed sensible." Mrs. Fletcher folded her hands tightly. Mr. Collins sat very upright, his expression attentive and faintly eager. Mrs. Garner watched Miss Marple with quiet trust. Mrs. Linton sat closest to the fire, her posture rigid, her hands clasped so firmly in her lap that the knuckles showed pale. Miss Marple let the silence stretch just long enough to grow uncomfortable. "We have all agreed," she began, "that Arthur Bellamy's passing was unfortunate but natural. We agreed upon it quickly, and with relief, there were nods. Agreement was easy. And yet, Miss Marple continued softly, there were certain details that did not fit comfortably with that agreement. She did not look at anyone in particular. She did not need to. The open gate, she said. The untouched tea. The letters written and never sent. The money lent quietly. The meeting arranged with discretion rather than formality. Mr. Collins shifted in his chair. Arthur Bellamy was a careful man, Miss Marple went on. He valued order. He disliked surprises, which is why he would not have left his gate open by chance. He opened it because he was expecting someone. Mrs. Linton's breath caught, though she said nothing. Someone he trusted enough to meet privately, Miss Marple said. Someone who understood his habits well enough to pour his tea, without asking how he took it. Someone who knew he would not drink it once a conversation became difficult. Mrs. Fletcher glanced toward Mrs. Linton, then quickly away. The letters, Miss Marple continued, were not threats, as some have suggested. They were invitations. Arthur was seeking resolution. He was preparing to settle a matter that troubled him deeply. She turned her gaze now, calmly and directly, toward Mrs. Linton. Money has a way of turning trust into pressure, Miss Marple said, especially when it is lent quietly, without witnesses. Mrs. Linton's lips parted. I do not know what you are implying. Miss Marple smiled kindly. I am not implying anything. I am simply describing. She rose from her chair, moving slowly. Her voice never raised. Arthur Bellamy lent money to someone he believed he was helping. He did so discreetly, to avoid embarrassment. But as time passed, he realized repayment was unlikely. Worse than that, he discovered that his kindness was being mistaken for silence. Mrs. Linton shook her head. This is all speculation. Is it? Miss Marple asked gently. Or is it memory? She crossed to the small table and picked up the sugar bowl. Arthur always took one spoon. Always. Yet the sugar bowl was untouched. That tells us someone else poured the tea. She set it down and turned slightly. That person trembled, she said. Not from grief, from fear. From the effort of maintaining composure. Mrs. Linton's shoulders began to shake. Miss Marple did not hurry. You met Arthur that evening through the garden gate, she said softly. You insisted upon it because you feared being seen. You believed discretion would protect you. Mrs. Linton stood abruptly. That is not true. Miss Marple looked at her with infinite patience. You had received his letter. You knew he intended to confront the matter. Quietly, but firmly. You knew he had seen a solicitor. You knew that if he spoke, your situation would become impossible to explain. Mrs. Garner gasped softly. The conversation did not go as you hoped, Miss Marple continued. Arthur was resolved. He intended to recover what was owed, or to speak openly if he could not. Mrs. Linton's voice broke. I never meant. Miss Marple raised a hand, gently. No one ever does, she said. What followed was not planned, but panic can be very quick. The room was utterly still. You did not arrive intending harm, Miss Marple said. But when Arthur refused to yield, when he stood by his decision, you acted. Mrs. Linton sank back into her chair, her composure finally gone. The garden was chosen because it was private, Miss Marple went on. The gate was opened deliberately. The tea was poured out of habit. And when the moment came, there were no raised voices. Only a sudden end to the conversation. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. I heard voices. Miss Marple turned to him calmly. You heard what you wished to hear, she said, and you repeated it in a way that made you useful without making you responsible. Mr. Collins flushed deeply and said nothing. Miss Marple returned her attention to Mrs. Linton. You believed, she said softly, that if Arthur were found in his garden, it would be assumed he had simply gone there and not returned. You relied upon the village's preference for tidy explanations. Mrs. Linton covered her face with her hands. I did not know what else to do, she whispered. He would not listen. He said he would go to the solicitor again. He said I had left him no choice. Miss Marple's voice softened further. And so you believed you had none either. The constable stepped forward quietly, his expression grave but not unkind. I will need to ask you to come with me, he said. Mrs. Linton nodded slowly, as though she had been expecting this moment all along. As she was led from the room, the village seemed to exhale. Chairs creaked. Someone sobbed quietly. No one looked at Miss Marple directly. She returned to her seat and folded her hands. It is always tempting, she said gently, to believe that kindness obliges silence. But kindness, when exploited, becomes dangerous. Mrs. Trent spoke at last. You knew, she said. From the beginning, Miss Marple smiled faintly, I suspected. Knowing requires patience. Mrs. Fletcher whispered, the gate. Yes, Miss Marple replied. The gate remembered what the village wished to forget. Outside, the evening settled fully. Lamps glowed. Curtains were drawn. Life resumed its careful order. Miss Marple stood and moved to the window. The lane looked peaceful again, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. Arthur Bellamy's garden gate was now firmly shut. Miss Marple regarded it with calm satisfaction, knowing that even the quietest places carry echoes, and that truth, once invited in, rarely leaves unnoticed. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly as the village returned to its routines, knew that justice had entered through the same gate as deception, and had closed it behind her. The village returned to itself with remarkable speed. Within days, the lane looked as it always had. Windows were opened at familiar hours. Curtains were shaken out and rehung. Baskets were carried to and from the shops with quiet purpose. Arthur Bellamy's cottage stood closed now. its garden trimmed by careful hands, its gate firmly latched, as though it wished to atone for its moment of indiscretion. People spoke of him kindly and briefly. They spoke even more briefly of Mrs. Linton. There was a shared understanding, unspoken yet complete, that some truths were better acknowledged once and then laid gently aside. The village did not deny what had happened. It simply declined to linger over it. Tragedy, like illness, was something to be survived with dignity and minimal disturbance. Miss Marple understood this instinct well. She did not challenge it. On the afternoon after everything had been settled, she walked slowly along the lane, pausing where Arthur Bellamy's garden met the path. The flowers were beginning to fade, their season nearly over, yet they still stood with quiet resilience. Someone had taken care to straighten the stones along the border. Someone had closed the gate properly. Miss Marple rested her hand lightly upon it. Arthur Bellamy had been a man of order, of small certainties. He had believed that politeness could resolve difficulty, that quiet arrangements could prevent public consequence. In many cases, he had been right. In this one, he had trusted too much in discretion, and too little in what desperation could do to an ordinary person. Miss Marple reflected that most harm was never committed by villains, but by people who believed themselves cornered. Later that evening, she sat in her own sitting room, a cup of tea warming her hands, the familiar hush settling comfortably around her. Outside, the village breathed softly, unaware of its own relief. The constable's footsteps had faded. The vicar's voice had resumed its reassuring cadence. Life, as it always did, had continued. Mrs. Garner passed by the window, pausing to offer a small wave. Miss Marple returned it with a smile. There would be kindness still. There would be routine. The village would hold together, bound by habit as much as affection. And yet something had changed, subtly and permanently. There would be fewer assumptions now. Fewer swift agreements when something seemed inconvenient to examine. A gate left open would be noticed. A cup left untouched would invite quiet thought. The village would not become suspicious, but it would become attentive. Miss Marple believed that was enough. She did not consider what she had done remarkable. She had simply listened and watched and remembered how easily fear hid itself behind manners. She had known that truth did not require force, only patience, and the willingness to speak softly when others preferred silence. Arthur Bellamy's life had ended quietly, but not without meaning. In its wake, the village had been reminded that calm surfaces could conceal urgent undercurrents, and that the smallest details often carried the greatest weight. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple set her cup aside and looked out once more toward the lane. The lamps glowed steadily now, their light untroubled by wind. Somewhere, a gate clicked shut with deliberate care. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Order had been restored, not by denial, but by understanding. And in that understanding lay the true comfort of village life. Not the absence of darkness, but the knowledge that it could be gently, firmly brought into the light.